This is Dr. James Strickler. This lecture will cover Chapter 1, Indigenous America, in the online textbook, The American Yawp. That first chapter in the American Yawp begins with a discussion of the indigenous peoples in America, and then eventually moves on to a discussion of European settlers coming to the New World. But I think it's more appropriate to approach those topics in the other order, because the history of the United States of America is primarily an extension of European history. So I think it's appropriate to begin with the first forays of Europeans into the New World. And the first of these was a Norseman named Leif Erikson, who led a band of settlers to the New World in what is currently Newfoundland in Canada to create a settlement which did not last. Now, while they, in their European sense, discovered the New World and left settlers here, their presence was not permanent, and their knowledge of the New World did not spread. And so later on, when we get to the story of Christopher Columbus eventually, we'll see how Europeans rediscovered the New World at a later time. And the story of that really begins with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, centered in the city of Rome in what is present-day Italy, controlled a vast empire that surrounded the Mediterranean Ocean and covered most of what is modern-day Europe. That empire lasted for several hundred years. But eventually it collapsed. Now, we could teach an entire course on the reasons for its collapse. You don't need to know that for right now. What you need to know is that the era that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire, which we call the Middle Ages, is also called the Dark Ages, because it's a time in which European regressed culturally and technologically, economically. What happened was the Roman Empire had bound various groups of people together, allowing them to share knowledge, share resources, and once the empire collapsed, that sharing collapsed with it, and the people's circumstances as a consequence became worse. They had less wealth, less knowledge, etc. Europe ended up divided into a whole maze of petty little kingdoms that squabbled with each other for hundreds of years thereafter. This, in essence, created a power vacuum. There was no big central authority that was in charge that could keep other powers away. The result of this was that Islam, as a cultural group, spread out from its founding in what is now Saudi Arabia to eventually invade the territories that were once part of the Roman Empire, including Europe itself. Muslim invaders crossed all the way into Europe at Constantinople on the border of present-day Turkey. They also took over most of what is present-day Spain. Well, that threat from Muslim invaders caused a reaction from those who were living in Europe. It caused these squabbling little kingdoms to begin to cooperate in some important ways. One of those was that they organized a series of invasions of Muslim territory, which they called Crusades. And the big intent of these Crusades was to drive Muslims away from European lands, but also to march all the way to the Middle East and reclaim the Holy Land, the area where the stories of the Bible are found, the land where Jesus was born, the city of Jerusalem. They didn't like that this other faith, this non-Christian faith, had control of those holy sites. So they organized armies to march there to reclaim it. These crusades happened over a couple hundred years. A series of them, one after another, marched across Europe and attacked Muslims in the Middle East to try to reclaim those lands from them. Now, what isn't so important here is the battles. It's the effect that these battles had on the European warriors when they finished and returned home. Their time spent in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East left them with a taste for Eastern goods. Things that they had never experienced in Europe, they found as they traveled abroad, and they wanted more of them even when they got back home. They were able to access these goods through a network of trade routes known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road tied nations across Asia all the way to China together so that they could trade goods with each other. So through this Silk Road, these materials were brought from as far away as China to the Eastern Mediterranean, where they could then be accessed by Europeans. Most famously, an Italian named Marco Polo traveled across the Silk Road all the way to China, and then eventually, many years later, returned to his home in Italy and wrote a very famous account of his journeys, which led people to become even more interested in the things that were found in the East and want to have some of them in their lives. Well, as these goods were brought from the East along the Silk Road, once they got to the Mediterranean, then someone had to distribute them to the various European countries that were now desiring them. And that was the Italians. The Italians had a virtual monopoly on trade within the Mediterranean basin. They controlled all the trade routes, and so if you wanted to buy some goods that came in from India or China, you had to get them from an Italian trader. Well, other countries didn't like this. They didn't like that they had to go through the middlemen of the Italians and give the Italians profits from the goods that they wanted. And so they sought their own trade routes. But the problem was the Italians controlled the Mediterranean trade, which meant that they controlled things coming in from the Silk Road. So other countries had to find alternative routes to reach the East to go get the trade goods themselves. Among the first to aggressively pursue other routes were the Portuguese, because a prince within the royal family of Portugal, a man who became known as Henry the Navigator, went out on his own journeys to explore other potential routes to the east by sailing around the continent of Africa. And then he sponsored others and created an attitude within Portugal that they could do this thing. Now, eventually, many years later, a Portuguese sailor named Vasco da Gama successfully led a mission that went all the way around the continent of Africa and eventually landed in India. And this was the beginning of setting up Portuguese trade routes between the country of Portugal, which is in Western Europe, and East Asia, India, China, places like that, by sailing around the Horn of Africa. Along the way, as the Portuguese stopped along the coast of Africa, they had an opportunity to trade goods with the natives there. The native Africans were very interested in some of the things that the Portuguese had, such as, for example, metal cookware, which they did not have themselves. And so they had to find things that they could trade with the Portuguese. And one of the things that they offered were slaves. It was a common practice among African tribes at this time that when they had a war with some other tribe, they would capture people from that other tribe and enslave them. Slavery was a common practice throughout the sub-Saharan Africa. And so naturally, they took this practice that they commonly did among each other, and they began to do it with the European traders that came along. In exchange for the goods that they could get from the Europeans, they gave them slaves, which then the Europeans turned around and made use of. One of the ways that the Europeans made use of the slaves was they set up a series of colonies out on islands in the Atlantic Ocean near the coast of Africa, where they could raise sugar. Sugar was one of the big things that they had discovered in their journeys toward the east. It's not a crop that grows natively within Europe. As a matter of fact, it originated in Southeast Asia. And so these trade routes oftentimes carried sugar across the Silk Roads and across the Mediterranean Ocean on Italian ships to get it to Europe so that Europeans could enjoy the taste of sugar. Well, eventually they discovered that they could grow sugar out on islands in the Atlantic Ocean, but they needed laborers to raise the sugar for them. And this is where they began to make use of the slaves that they traded for in Africa. This then led to the Portuguese to build the first European building in sub-Saharan Africa, a fort and a slave trade center on the coast of Africa that became known as Elmina Castle. Well, it wasn't just the Portuguese who were trying to get goods from the east, such as sugar. so that they could enjoy them without having to pay the Italians as middlemen for them. The Spanish also began to turn their eyes toward the east. Now, first they had to take care of some business at home, and that was the fact that most of their country had been taken over by Muslims, as we talked about a few moments ago. But they were able to then focus on getting the Muslims out after two of the big royal families in Spain unified with the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, who became then Queen and King of Spain. Once the two big royal families were united, then they were able to organize the Spanish people to fight a series of wars over many years to eventually drive the Muslims out of Spain. This became known as the Reconquista, and Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were the ones that completed the Reconquista by finally driving the last of the Muslims out of their country. After they had completed the reconquest of Spain and had eliminated the Muslim invaders and conquerors, Spain then turned its eyes to establishing its own trade routes to the east to compete with the Portuguese and the Italians. But they had a problem. The Italians already controlled the trade routes across the Mediterranean that connected to the Silk Road. The Portuguese already controlled the trade routes around Africa and then across the Indian Ocean to places like India and China. So Spain had to find another way to get its goods without having to go through the middlemen of either the Italians or the Portuguese. Their opportunity came when an Italian would-be explorer, a man named Christopher Columbus, came to the King and Queen of Spain and offered his services to find a trade route to the east by first selling west. See, people at this time knew that the earth was round, but they misunderstood exactly how big it was. And so Christopher Columbus thought he could just sail out across the Atlantic Ocean, and if he sailed far enough, he'd run into China or India on the other side. And he got funding from the King and Queen of Spain to set off on this adventure. Now, his expedition did not actually make it all the way to China or India, even though he thought he did. But it landed on an island in the Caribbean Ocean. Europeans were completely unaware that the Americas lay between them and Asia. They had lost the knowledge of the Norseman like Leif Erikson, who knew that there were lands out there. So Christopher Columbus, when he made land in 1492 in the islands of the Caribbean, he thought that he had made it all the way to India. And he called this place the Indies, and he called the people he found there Indians. And the name stuck. That's why to this day we call natives of the American continents Indians. It was a mistaken identification on his part, but it's stuck around all the way into modern times. Once Columbus found these new lands, he returned to Spain, and he told them that there were many opportunities in the New World. He promised them that they'd be able to find gold, but they would also be able to find converts for Christianity. This is a very important thing to the people of Spain at the time, that they spread the good word of their religious faith to other people around the world. And so they saw these people that he had met in what he thought was India, who did not have Christianity, and this became another big motivation for them to come. They wanted to establish trade routes, they wanted to find gold and silver, they wanted to get rich, but they also wanted to spread their religion around the world. So he led a series of voyages, and this opened up a constant contact between the people of Europe and the people of the Americas. Among the people that followed after Christopher Columbus, coming from Europe to explore this new world, was a man named Amerigo Vespucci. He was the one who first coined the term New World to describe this place that he had visited, because he realized that it was not Asia that they had reached, that it was some new unknown continent. And when he returned to Europe, he reported it as such. Well, as a result, a map maker who was trying to draw a map of these new lands that had been found ended up naming them after Amerigo Vespucci, who had identified them as new continents. And then that name stuck. That's why the Americas are called the Americas today, after Amerigo Vespucci. Well, the Europeans that came here discovered that there were people already living here, what we can call pre-Columbian natives. And what we mean by that is the native people of North and South America who are here before Columbus came and connected these two worlds, the old world and the new world, together. The way that these pre-Columbian natives got to the Americas is theorized to have happened during the last ice age. What is believed to happen is that during the last ice age, as much of the water of the earth was frozen in ice caps, the level of the seas dropped, exposing land that connected Asia and North America across what is today the Bering Sea. This area that is called Beringia was a land bridge between Asia and North America that allowed tribesmen thousands of years ago to migrate across to what is present-day Alaska, and then through an ice-free corridor or along the coast, eventually into North America, and then from there through Central America and on to South America. Now, we aren't sure exactly what route they took or when they came, but what we do know is we have found evidence of them being all the way down to the tip of South America by 12,500 BC. Or in other words, almost 15,000 years ago, they had already reached that far. So however they got to North America, to the Americas, they spread out far and wide, all over both continents. And they became the ancestors of what would eventually be called by Christopher Columbus Indians, the native inhabitants of North and South America. These natives are oftentimes thought of in mythological terms as being living in peaceful harmony with each other and nature before the evil Europeans came along and ruined the Eden that they were living in. Now, I call this a myth because it's simply not true. Native Americans manipulated their ecology, their environment around them, just as much as any other people around the world. They cleared out forests, they created cropland, they changed the course of rivers, whatever they needed to do to improve their lives, just as other people all over the world have done. Now, they did this to allow them to engage in agriculture, to grow food crops, just like people in other places. There were three main food crops grown in America, particularly North America, I should say. Since we're focusing on United States history, that's the most relevant part of the Americas for us. One of those was maize, what we today call corn. There were many varieties of it. The kind you get in the store that's old yellow is a modern invention from these old forms. But they also had two other crops that they would raise with corn, squash and beans. And these three kinds of crops that they base their primary agriculture on were oftentimes called, where they have been referred to as the Three Sisters. In addition to them manipulating their environment, they also were not as peaceful as legend has them. Native Americans participated in practices of slavery and human sacrifice. These practices were actually widespread among people in the Americas, particularly slavery. Human sacrifice was sometimes done on massive scales, with thousands of people being sacrificed at one time to their gods. So, no, they were not the peaceful people that you might imagine, as you see portrayed in movies. They also engaged in many, many, many wars with each other. These wars were fought over resources. They were fought over just because they didn't like each other. There were constant squabbles between the many tribes that inhabited North and South America. One of the reasons for this was that there were so many tribes speaking so many different languages. Here's a map of the many language groupings just within what would eventually become the United States of America. Dozens. Matter of fact, if you go to sub-languages, hundreds of different languages being spoken by different people. And languages oftentimes separate people in important ways. When somebody else speaks a different language, you see them as the other, different than you. And so there were constant conflicts between these native groups within America. They were fighting with each other, they were enslaving each other, they were sacrificing each other. Yet among all this tumult, there were some great civilizations that flourished in the Americas. before the Europeans came. Within what would eventually become the United States of America, one of the more impressive civilizations was the Puebloans civilization in southeastern, what would eventually be the southeastern United States. They left ruins behind such as those at Mesa Verde, a national park in Colorado, and Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico. These were massive structures where many people lived in buildings that they built that remain now thousands of years later. The site at Pueblo Bonito is one of the biggest buildings in the world during this time period. It's one continuous structure that housed an entire city of thousands of people, possibly. Another impressive culture in what would eventually be the United States of America is known as the Mississippian Mound Builders. They're described that way because they built earthen mounds all over the central United States. One of their biggest collection of mounds is in a place that became eventually known as Cahokia. It's near what is present-day St. Louis. There they built hundreds of mounds that had buildings on top of them. As much as 40,000 people were thought to live in this community. They probably built these mounds to elevate their houses above the floodplain of the Mississippi. They had their city there because they had the rich soil brought by the Mississippi floods to raise their crops in. But if the floods came along, they could all die if they couldn't get up above the water. So that's probably why they built the mounds and then placed their houses upon them. But they built hundreds of mounds throughout this region of the country that still exists today, even though their culture is long gone. But those were not even the most impressive civilizations in the Americas before the coming of Columbus. The most impressive civilizations were found in what is now today Mexico and South America. One of these was the Mayan Empire, which existed in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico hundreds of years before the Europeans came. They built vast cities, and they had mastery over many scientific techniques, such as they built observatories to do astronomy, things like that. They were an intricate empire with lots of trade, lots of people, lots of cities, but eventually they collapsed. Most likely explanation we have today is because they outstripped their resources. They had too many people, they couldn't feed them anymore, their economy collapsed, people died, and they dispersed. It was a collapse of an empire like all empires seem eventually doomed to undergo. But there were some great empires still around when the Spanish and other explorers eventually came to the Americas. One of these was the Aztec Empire in what is now today Mexico. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, sat where present-day Mexico City is. It was on an island out in the midst of a big lake. Their empire had lasted for a couple hundred years before they encountered the Spanish. And we'll talk in a few moments about what happened when that took place. But they built again, vast cities. They had vast agricultural works. They built huge temples and observatories for astronomy and things like that. They were an advanced civilization. To the south, in what is now present-day Peru and adjoining countries in South America, there was the Inca Empire during the same time period. The Inca Empire existed up in the Andes Mountains. And again, they had vast agricultural works on terraced hillsides. They built great cities out of stone. They fought big wars and captured and conquered neighboring countries and built their own very wealthy, very advanced empire also. But again, notice the end date of the empire, 1533, a similar time period to when the Aztec Empire ended. And it's because of the coming of the Europeans. You see, these great civilizations of the Americas were doomed by what we call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange refers to the sudden exchange of goods between the Old World and the New World. Okay, so what do I mean by this? I mean that there were things that people had in the Old World that they didn't have in the New World that they brought over to the New World. Things like, for example, sugar that I mentioned before, bananas, which today we associate bananas being grown in Central America, but they were not native to Central America. Livestock like cattle, pigs, things like that were not known in the Americas until they were brought here by Europeans. Horses. You may have these images of Native Americans riding horses out on the Great Plains. Horses did not exist among them until Europeans brought them. And things went back the other direction too. Things that were unknown in Europe or anywhere in the Old World until they were discovered in the New World and brought to Europe. Things like, for example, potatoes and tomatoes came to Europe for the first time. Now, those are products that we associate with European countries now. We think about potatoes being associated with Ireland. There's the famous Irish potato famine. We think about tomatoes being associated with Italian cooking. Well, those things didn't exist in Europe until after Columbus rediscovered the New World and explorers started going back and forth, and these goods were brought to Europe. The reason that this Columbian Exchange doomed the great civilizations of the Old World is that they were not prepared for the kind of things that the Europeans would come with. First of all, even as advanced as some of these cultures were in the New World, there were certain things that they had just never grasped as inventions. For example, they had no wheeled vehicles. They had no carts, no cars of any sort. They hadn't even put together any complex machines. Now, one of the strange things about this is they were aware of wheels. They put wheels on toys for their children to play with. But somehow it never crossed their minds to put them on a cart that then could be pulled to make transportation of goods easier. They also did not have any large domesticated animals. Now, large animals that could have potentially been domesticated did exist in the New World at one point. For example, horses were here when humans came and began to settle in North and South America. But the problem is that those original human inhabitants in the Americas killed off all these large animals. They became all extinct. And so they had no large animals like cows or horses or things like that to domesticate, to use as animals of burden. But the Europeans did. They brought horses with them back to the Americas. And when the natives first saw men riding around on horses, they were really kind of freaked out about it. They didn't understand it. Also, the native cultures of North and South America lacked written languages. Now, they had some other mechanisms for passing on information, particularly for doing math. The Incas famously tied knots in ropes to keep track of numbers so that they could, for example, move troops around or engage in trade with each other. But they did not have written languages to pass information on in the way that we think of. Now, there are some exceptions to that. For example, the Mayans had a complex language using pictures that they carved into rock, and in some cases painted on other things. But that was a rare exception. In general, the native tribes that the Europeans encountered when they came here did not have written languages, put them at a disadvantage for exchanging information with each other about what was going on in the world. They also lacked weapons of the quality that the Europeans brought. They had not mastered the production of steel, and they did not have guns and gunpowder. So suddenly these Europeans would come and they would pull out a gun, primitive compared to our modern guns, but they would pull out guns and start shooting. And it was this miraculous death that was inflicted from on far. It seemed magical to the natives. Natives also did not generally have the concept of private property. Now, this doesn't mean that they couldn't ever exclude anybody from a piece of property. The way that they generally thought of it was that if you occupied a place and were actively using it, then it was yours. But if you got up and left and went someplace else, then anybody else could come in and take it. There was no permanence to it. And so oftentimes, Europeans, when they got here, they would make deals with the natives. They would say, okay, we will give you these goods that you want, like, for example, metal cooking pots. Again, it was something that the natives that they encountered were amazed by. We'll give you this cooking pot in exchange. We get this hunk of land. Now, from the native point of view, that seems to mean, okay, I guess you can use that land while you're here. And then when you leave, it's up for grabs again. But from the European point of view, it was no. I just made a deal to buy this land. Now it's mine forever. And so those kind of interactions ended up being very one-sided. Native Americans also lacked political unity. Again, as I showed you on that map of all the different languages, they were divided up into many small groups that all squabbled with each other. Even those big empires that I talked about, like the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, they were empires that were made of small groups that had been conquered by these more powerful nations, but didn't like that they were conquered and were ready to rebel if they could. And that ends up being used against them. But probably the most important problem that they had in standing up against the Europeans was they lacked immunity to the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. These diseases, such as smallpox, swept ahead of the Europeans, and they killed, by our best modern estimates, more than 90% of the native population of the Americas. So there were people that were dying of these European diseases, such as measles or smallpox or whatever it may be, who had never even heard of Europeans. They didn't even know that white men existed. But these diseases swept ahead. Now, the reason they swept ahead is Europeans land on the coast of a country. They interact with some natives there. They're still on the coast. The natives go inland. They speak to some other people in some other village. They catch the disease. They go and they speak to some people in some other village. They catch the disease. And the disease spreads out ahead across the continents without the white people even being there yet. This was devastating. And this was generally not intentional. The Europeans didn't understand diseases any better than the natives of America, of North and South America, understood them at this time. But they had grown up around these diseases in Europe, primarily because they had grown up around domesticated animals. And they had already developed immunity to them. The people that were going to die from these diseases had died out generations before in Europe. And so they had an immunity to them. But they came to America where these people had not ever encountered these diseases, and it wiped out the natives. Now this led then Europeans, as they began coming to America and settle, as viewing America as just empty land. The natives are all dead. It's just empty. And this is one of the reasons we get the myth of the Indians living in harmony with nature, because Europeans would come and settle and they would just find empty land that had been overgrown as nature had reclaimed it from the Indians that had all died from the diseases. So these many advantages that Europeans had over the natives led the natives to be conquered by the Europeans that came to America to eventually colonize it. Among the first people that intentionally engaged in this process of conquering the natives were people who came from Spain that were known as conquistadors. They were professional soldiers who came to America with the intent of conquering people so that they could become rich and powerful. Oftentimes, they were younger sons of rich families. Now, the reason that was true was because the way things were done in Europe during this time period was that if a family had wealth to pass on, it got passed on to the oldest son, and none went to his younger brothers. So if you're a younger brother, you didn't get anything. The only way you're going to become wealthy and powerful like your family was accustomed to was to go out somewhere in the world and conquer somebody else. And so they saw opportunity in America. They saw these natives that were already at great disadvantages as an opportunity for plunder and conquest. The most famous of these conquistadors was a man named Hernando Cortez, who led a small group of Spaniards to conquer the mighty Aztec nation. Now remember, disease is already weakening these people. The Spanish have technology that the natives don't have, such as metal armor, swords, guns, horses, things like that. But that isn't the primary reason why a small band, and when I say a small band, I'm talking about a few dozen Spaniards were able to conquer a country of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. The biggest reason was because of the infighting within the country itself. The Aztecs, to create their empire, had conquered small groups of people who didn't like the Aztecs. And so as the Spaniards marched on the capital of the Aztec Empire, they gathered allies from within the empire itself, people who saw the Spaniards as their opportunity to get rid of their Aztec overlords. And so when eventually the Spanish conquer the Aztecs, they do it with the help of other natives, who eventually they subjugate also. A similar story played out with the Inca Empire. in the Andes Mountains. A man named Francisco Pizarro also led a small band of Spaniards there who were able to capture the Inca king and use that to their advantage, fight some skirmishes, and eventually take over the entire Inca Empire through a similar process that Cortez used with the Aztecs. So the great empires that were left in the Americas at the time that the Europeans came were quickly conquered by the Europeans because of all these advantages that they had, of diseases that swept ahead of them, technological advantages that they have, even political advantages they had because they were united in their effort to conquer, while the natives were divided among each other, squabbling with each other, and were willing to ally with these invaders to defeat each other. So with these big conquests by people like Cortez and Pizarro, other people coming from Spain looked for their own opportunities to go find somebody to conquer so that they could become wealthy and powerful too. Among those who went out looking for these things was a man named Ponce de Leon, who was a Spanish explorer who was the first to come into what would be now today the United States of America. He explored along the coast of Florida. Now, one of the things that he is said to have been searching for was the fountain of youth in Florida. Well, he was also looking for a place to potentially conquer for his own empire. But Florida was not a particularly good place at this time for that sort of thing to happen. But it didn't stop the Spanish from continuing to look for other places. Another one of their explorers that came into this area of what would eventually be the United States of America was a man named Hernando de Soto. He and his group of people were probably the first Europeans to go through what is now today the state of Georgia and other adjoining states. They landed in Florida and began to make a long overland journey throughout the southeast, what would eventually become the southeastern United States. Hernando de Soto finally died while on this journey, but his exploration had extreme consequences. Not only did he unknowingly spread disease among the natives, as we already talked about, but also it is quite likely that pigs, who were not native to North America, but are now commonly found throughout the wilds of North America, particularly in the southeastern United States, were originally brought here by De Soto's expedition. See, they brought a herd of pigs with them so they would have something to eat, and they would actually herd this group of pigs with them around as they explored. And some of the pigs escaped out into the woods, and their descendants are still out in the woods today. Eventually, the Spanish founded a city in what is now present-day Florida, known as St. Augustine. This is the oldest European city within what would become the United States of America, founded by the Spaniards in 1565. Now, this might be a good time to make a comment about the dates that I've been showing on these slides. I hope that as you've been taking notes about the information I've been presenting, that you actually have been writing down the dates, because I think they're very useful for you to keep track of what happened when. But I just want you to know that when you eventually have an exam in this course, that I will not ask you for any of the dates specifically. I have 8 children, and I have a hard enough time remembering their birthdays. I'm not going to ask anybody else to memorize dates for an exam, but they are useful for knowing what happened before what and after what. St. Augustine was founded in 1565. It is the oldest city in what is present day the United States of America. Another city founded by Spanish explorers looking for places to conquer, this time in the southwestern United States, is the city of Santa Fe in New Mexico. A Spanish explorer, Juan de Onati, I think that's how you say it, although I may not be right, founded the city of Santa Fe in 1610. Now, he had gone north on foot, I shouldn't say on foot, on horseback, with a group of exploring Spaniards from Mexico. Remember, Mexico is where the Aztec Empire was, which had already been conquered by the Spanish, like 80 years beforehand. It was an old part of their conquerings in the New World at this point, and they were moving out and exploring elsewhere. And so this Spanish explorer came north into what is now present-day New Mexico and established a Spanish city there also. So as the Spanish spread out and conquered various native groups, they set up a system that became known as Alcomienda. Um, what this allowed was that the Spanish government would grant areas of land to Spaniards who came to America to live. But what's important about them not just granting the land is they would grant them the labor of any natives that lived on that land. So a Spaniard would be told, okay, this is your land now, and any Native Americans who live on this land, you can force them to work for you. Now, they were not slaves in the sense that you may think of slavery where the Spanish overlord actually owned those people. But they were slaves in the sense that he could require labor from them. And if they did not give the labor, then he could punish them for that, potentially even kill them for that. So this became a common system among the Spanish as they set up their colonies in the New World. Among the Spanish that lived in the New World, there was a caste system. And what is meant by this is that different groups in society were more valued than others. At the bottom of this caste system were the Indians, the natives. Again, we go back to the beginning. It's a mislabel to call them Indians. It's a mistake because Christopher Columbus thought he was in India. But you know who I'm talking about, the natives of the Americas. They were considered the lowest rank within society. Even if they were free, they were not as good as the Spaniards. Then there were the mestizos. These were people of mixed race. The Spaniards came here. Oftentimes they were men. Men wanted wives. There weren't enough European wives to go around, and so they ended up oftentimes marrying native women. Even if they didn't marry them, they would have sex with them and produce children, and you ended up with a large number of mixed race children. These mestizos are actually the ancestors, for the most part, of the people of, say, Mexico and other places in South America that we think of as being Hispanic. Well, they are generally of mixed ancestry. They have some native Indian ancestry, and they also have European ancestry through the Spaniards. Well, they were the next rung up in society. Then there are the criollos. These are people that were pure blood Spaniards. They could trace their ancestry back. There were no natives that they were descended from. No, I should say no Native Americans that they were descended from, but they were born here in America. So they were not considered quite as socially elite as those who came from Spain to live in America. They were called the peninsulares. They were the top of the social structure, the people who had been born in Spain and then came to live in the New World. So the Spanish conquests in the New World were very much, from our modern point of view, brutal, racist, classist, with different groups and different societies. But this is the way things were back then. This was common. And there were no perfect good people. As I talked about, the natives themselves that are sometimes mythologized as being living in peace and harmony. No, they were brutal and cruel to each other too. Eventually, in future chapters, we'll talk about the slave trade with Africa and the brutality of slavery practiced in the United States of America and how, from our modern point of view, it is evil and awful too. But where did they get the slaves from? They got them from the Africans who were enslaving each other. When we talk about this history, there are no innocent parties. All people back then engaged in things that, from our modern point of view, we might look down upon. But that was the nature of the world at the time. And that ends this lecture on Chapter 1 in the American Yawp. And I hope you enjoyed it and look forward to doing the next chapter for you.